If you like sci-fi stories, please like or subscribe to help our channel grow. Enjoy this story.
Clockwork Fugitive. The gears never lied. At least that's what Evelyn Matthews told herself as she balanced precariously on a rickety stool, her magnifying goggles reflecting a constellation of tiny mechanical components. Brass shavings dusted her dark hair like forgotten snowflakes, a testament to hours of uninterrupted work. Just one more calibration, she muttered, her fingers, wrapped in leather-tipped precision gloves, delicately adjusting a series of interlocking quantum resonators. The device before her wasn't just another invention. It was a symphony of mechanical possibility, a machine that could potentially rewrite the fundamental understanding of time itself. Outside her workshop window, the city of New Chronos hummed with mechanical life. Brass airships drifted between clock towers that punctured the perpetually gray sky, their massive gears visible through translucent panels. Automatons trudged along cobblestone streets, their mechanical joints synchronized in an endless urban ballet. But Evelyn hardly noticed. Her world was contained within these 12 square meters of organized chaos, blueprints pinned to every available surface, half-completed inventions balanced precariously on shelves, and at the center, her masterpiece. The temporal resonance chamber looked like something between a grandfather clock and a mad scientist's fever dream. Brass tubes curved like Baroque musical instruments, quantum entanglement coils wrapped in intricate copper meshwork, and at its heart, a crystalline core that seemed to shimmer with potential energy. A sudden loud knock interrupted her concentration. "Delivery for Matthews Innovations," a gruff voice called from beyond the door. Evelyn sighed. Deliveries meant disruption, and disruption meant potential disaster when working with quantum temporal mechanics. "Leave it by the door," she shouted back, not taking her eyes off the delicate calibration. The knock came again, more insistent. "I said—" The door exploded inward. Black uniformed agents flooded her workshop, their polished boots crushing delicate technical diagrams beneath them. At their head stood a tall, severe man with eyes that seemed carved from granite, Inspector Garrick. "Evelyn Matthews," he announced, his voice a mechanical precision of controlled anger. "You are hereby charged with seditious technological research and violation of the Chronological Preservation Act." Her quantum resonators began to vibrate, responding to the sudden surge of emotional energy in the room. Tiny arcs of blue-white electricity danced between the brass components. "This is a mistake," Evelyn said, her voice surprisingly calm. "I'm simply conducting theoretical research." Garrick's eyes narrowed. "Theoretical research that could unravel the very fabric of our temporal understanding? The government cannot allow such potential chaos." In that moment, Evelyn realized her life would never be the same. Her invention, her beautiful, impossible machine, had just transformed from a scientific marvel into a target, and she was now a fugitive. The alleyways of New Chronos were a labyrinth of steam and shadow. Evelyn clutched her most critical invention, a leather satchel containing fragments of the temporal resonance chamber, close to her chest. Her carefully pressed inventor's jacket was now torn and dust-covered, a far cry from her usual meticulously maintained appearance. Behind her, the rhythmic stomp of government boots echoed off cobblestone and brick. Inspector Garrick's agents were nothing if not persistent. "Left or right?" she whispered to herself, a habit born of years of solitary problem-solving. The alley forked, steam rising from a broken water main creating a ghostly veil of uncertainty. A small hand grabbed her wrist. "This way," a young voice whispered urgently. Before she could protest, Evelyn found herself yanked into a narrow gap between two buildings. The hand belonged to a street-thin boy, perhaps 12 years old, with eyes that looked far older than his years. "Who?" she started to ask. "Shh," the boy hissed, pressing a finger to his lips. The government agents thundered past their hiding spot. Evelyn could hear the precise mechanical rhythm of their synchronized boots, regulation marching, engineered down to the millisecond. When silence finally descended, the boy turned to her. "I'm Tobias," he said simply, "and you're in trouble." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. That's quite an understatement. A hint of a smile crossed Tobias's face. "I know people who might help, but it'll cost you." "I'm an inventor," Evelyn responded, "not a wealthy woman. What could I possibly offer?" Tobias's eyes dropped to her satchel. Whatever's in that bag looks important, valuable even. Smart kid, Evelyn thought. Too smart to be just another street urchin. I'm looking for help, she said carefully, not more trouble. My sister, Tobias said suddenly, his bravado momentarily dropping. She disappeared, working for some government research division. If you can help me find her, I'll help you disappear. The proposal hung in the air between them, a transaction of mutual desperation. Evelyn's mind raced. Her temporal research had always suggested that seemingly random encounters were anything but random. Quantum entanglement wasn't just a scientific principle, it was a way of understanding how the universe connected its most unlikely threads. Deal, she said, extending her hand. As they shook, a distant clock tower began to chime, but something was wrong with its rhythm. The gears seemed to skip, to hesitate, as if time itself was momentarily confused. Tobias didn't seem to notice, but Evelyn knew. Something in the city was changing, and her invention was at the heart of it. The abandoned clockmaker's warehouse smelled of rust, oil, and forgotten dreams. Evelyn spread the salvaged components of her temporal resonance device across a dust-covered workbench, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. Tobias watched from a nearby stack of wooden crates, his street-honed curiosity barely contained. So this thing is supposed to do. What exactly? It's not about what it's supposed to do, Evelyn muttered, but what it can do. She held up a crystalline component that seemed to capture and refract light in impossible ways. Quantum temporal manipulation isn't just about moving through time. It's about understanding how time moves through us. The device was incomplete, a jigsaw puzzle with critical pieces missing. But even in its fractured state, it pulsed with an energy that made the air around it feel thick and charged. Hand me that brass coupling, she directed Tobias, who complied without question. The moment the final piece connected, something extraordinary happened. The warehouse dissolved. Not physically, but in Evelyn's perception. Suddenly, she was everywhere and nowhere. She saw herself from multiple angles, multiple moments. A version of her was still in the laboratory when the government agents burst in. Another version was working on the device years earlier. Yet another was standing in a courtroom, defending her research. Fascinating, she whispered, even as multiple versions of her spoke the exact same word. Tobias looked concerned. Are you okay? But Evelyn was lost in the temporal cascade. Each timeline was a thread, interconnected yet distinct. She could see the butterfly effect of her smallest decisions, how a missed breakfast in one timeline created a cascade of changes that altered entire political landscapes in another. One vision crystallized. Her sister, long presumed dead, alive in a research facility. But which timeline? Which version of reality? When the vision cleared, Evelyn found herself back in the warehouse, breathing heavily. Tobias was shaking her shoulder. What did you see? He demanded. She looked at him, her eyes refocusing. Everything, and nothing. A mechanical clock on the wall ticked, but its rhythm was slightly off, as if time itself was recalibrating. We're not just running from the government, Evelyn said, her voice steady. We're running from something much bigger. Outside, the first hints of a mechanical storm began to gather. In New Chronos, even the weather seemed engineered, its clouds moving with suspicious precision. Tobias waited, sensing something momentous had just occurred. Evelyn began reassembling the device, her movements faster now, more urgent. We need to find out what's really happening, and my invention is the key. Inspector Marcus Garrick studied the personnel file with the same methodical precision he applied to everything in his life. Evelyn Matthews, brilliant inventor, potential threat to temporal stability, now fugitive. The file told a story, but Garrick knew files never told the whole truth. His office in the Central Chronological Preservation Bureau was a temple of bureaucratic order. Mechanical filing systems clicked and whirred, sorting classified documents with inhuman efficiency. Holographic maps tracked potential temporal anomalies, their blue-white lines pulsing like veins of information. Sir, his assistant entered, a young administrative worker whose name Garrick could never quite remember. We've tracked Matthews to the industrial district's abandoned sector. Garrick's hand unconsciously touched the quantum suppression device at his belt, a technological marvel designed to neutralize unauthorized temporal research. But something felt off. Across the city, In a makeshift hideout buried deep within New Chronos' mechanical underbelly, Tobias was making a discovery of his own. "Look at this," he said, spreading out a collection of fragmented documents he'd lifted from a government messenger. Evelyn leaned closer, her inventor's eyes quickly parsing the technical diagrams and encrypted notes. "These aren't just research papers," she muttered. "These are recruitment records for experimental human subjects." The documents referenced a program called temporal concordance, a series of experiments that seemed to blend medical research with quantum mechanics. And there, buried in the margins, a name that made Tobias's breath catch. "Helena," he whispered. His sister's name. Evelyn's temporal device, still partially dismantled, began to hum. Not with its usual precise frequency, but with an irregular pulse that suggested something was changing. Back in his office, Inspector Garrick received an encrypted transmission. The message was brief, but it made him pause. Something in the official narrative was unraveling, and he was beginning to suspect the very system he devoted his life to protecting might not be what it seemed. Authorization code Delta 9 temporal. He spoke into his communication device. Verify current operational parameters for Project Concordance. Silence. Then a response that made no sense. A series of temporal coordinates that shouldn't exist. A message that suggested the boundaries between observation and participation were far more blurred than anyone had imagined. Outside, the mechanical clouds of New Chronos began to gather. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. The underground resistance headquarters looked nothing like Evelyn had imagined. Instead of a dramatic war room, it was a converted mechanical workshop filled with deconstructed automatons, half-finished inventions, and people who looked more like exhausted engineers than revolutionary fighters. "We call ourselves the temporal mechanics," explained Arya, a woman with intricate gearwork tattoos running along her forearms. Not as dramatic as resistance, but more accurate. Tobias leaned against a workbench, his street-honed skepticism on full display. "And what exactly do you resist?" Arya's laugh was sharp and sudden. "Everything. Primarily, the systematic suppression of technological innovation and human potential." She spread out a series of documents that made Evelyn's scientific mind race. Experimental research logs, heavily redacted but still revealing glimpses of something extraordinary. Experiments that suggested humans could be more than just subjects, they could be conduits of temporal energy. "Your sister's research," Evelyn said to Tobias, tracing a line of complex mathematical equations. "It wasn't just medical. It was about understanding how human consciousness interacts with temporal mechanics." The room fell silent. Outside, the constant mechanical rhythm of New Chronos continued, airships drifting between clock towers, steam vents releasing pressure in perfectly timed intervals. "The government doesn't want true innovation," Arya explained. "They want control. Your temporal device, Evelyn, represents something they fear more than anything: unpredictability." Tobias found a diagram of his sister Helena, young, brilliant, with eyes that seemed to look through the paper itself. "What happened to her?" he asked, his usual bravado replaced by a vulnerability that surprised even himself. Arya's expression softened. She discovered something big enough to make her disappear. The temporal device, still partially assembled, began to hum, not with its usual precise frequency, but with an irregular pulse that suggested something was changing. A mechanical messenger burst through a pneumatic tube, its brass cylinder spinning to a stop. Arya unrolled the message, her eyes widening. "Inspector Garrick," she said, "is asking to meet." Evelyn and Tobias exchanged looks. Nothing in New Chronos was ever as simple as it seemed. Outside, a massive clock tower began to chime, but something was wrong with its rhythm. The gears seemed to skip, to hesitate, as if time itself was momentarily confused. "Well," Evelyn said, a hint of dark humor in her voice, "I suppose this is where things get interesting." The resistance workshop fell silent as Evelyn's temporal device began to pulse with an increasingly erratic rhythm. Arya's gearwork tattoos seemed to shimmer, the intricate metal designs catching light in impossible ways. "This isn't just a machine," Evelyn muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "It's a conversation between different versions of reality." Tobias watched, equal parts fascinated and terrified. "What does that even mean?" A holographic projection erupted from the device. Not a clear image, but a fractal explosion of potential memories. Evelyn saw herself. Multiple versions, some older, some younger, some wearing clothing she didn't recognize. One memory crystallized. She was in a laboratory, but not her current one, sleeker, more advanced, working on the same device but with a crucial difference. Her hands moved with a confidence she didn't yet possess, making adjustments that seemed to bend the very fabric of scientific understanding. "I created this," she whispered, "but not just once, in multiple timelines." The projection showed a disturbing truth. In almost every potential timeline, she invented the device, sometimes out of scientific curiosity, sometimes as an act of rebellion, sometimes as a desperate attempt to change something fundamental about her world. A younger version of herself looked directly out of the projection. "Some inventions choose their inventor," she said, her voice echoing with a strange resonance, "not the other way around." Tobias touched the projection. It rippled like water, sending waves of temporal energy cascading through the room. "Your sister," Evelyn said suddenly to Tobias. She wasn't just researching this. She was part of it, a critical component in understanding how human consciousness interacts with temporal mechanics. The clock towers outside began to chime, but not in unison. Each tower rang at a slightly different moment, creating a cacophony that suggested time itself was losing its standard rhythm. Inspector Garrick's impending meeting suddenly felt like more than just a potential alliance. It felt like a convergence point, a moment where multiple realities might intersect. "We're not just running from something," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "We're running towards something, a moment of fundamental change." The temporal device hummed, waited, as if it were listening. The meeting place was neutral ground, a forgotten mechanical library where steam-powered information machines stood like silent witnesses. Inspector Garrick arrived precisely at midnight, his government-issue coat casting sharp shadows across dust-covered reference books. Evelyn was already there, the partial temporal device tucked carefully in her leather satchel. "You're not what I expected," Garrick said, breaking the silence. "And you're exactly what I expected," Evelyn retorted, a government agent wrestling with his own conscience. Tobias lurked in the shadows, watching every movement with the intensity of a street-raised survivor. Garrick placed a holographic projection on the library's central reading table. It showed a series of interconnected timelines, each one a potential future, each one more catastrophic than the last. "Project Concordance was never about control," he explained. "It was about prevention." The projections revealed a horrifying potential future: technological collapse, entire cities erased by temporal instability, human consciousness fractured across multiple realities. "Your device," Garrick said, pointing to Evelyn's temporal resonance chamber, "is both the problem and the potential solution." Tobias stepped forward. "What about my sister, Helena? Where does she fit in all of this?" A moment of silence. Then Garrick spoke. "She was the key, the first human capable of truly understanding temporal mechanics, not as a science, but as a living system." The device in Evelyn's satchel began to pulse. Not with electricity, but with something more fundamental, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the very heartbeat of the city. "We have approximately 72 hours, Garrick continued, before the temporal cascade becomes irreversible. Your invention can either prevent the collapse or become the trigger that destroys everything." Outside, the mechanical clouds of New Chronos began to gather. The clock towers seemed to lean slightly, as if the very architecture of the city was becoming unstable. Evelyn looked at Garrick, at Tobias, at the device. "Well," she said, a hint of dark humor cutting through the tension, "no pressure." The first intervention seemed simple enough: a minor adjustment, a single gear repositioned, a conversation slightly altered. But in New Chronos, nothing was ever simple. Evelyn's fingers danced across the temporal resonance device, each movement calculated with mathematical precision. Inspector Garrick watched, his typically rigid posture betraying a hint of nervous energy. "We're not changing history," Evelyn muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "We're redirecting potential." Tobias leaned against a wall of mechanical archives, his streetwise skepticism etched across his young face. "And how's that working out?" The first timeline shift was subtle. A government research facility that had previously conducted unethical experiments simply ceased to exist. In its place, a public library materialized, complete with decades of seemingly authentic historical records. Fascinating, Garrick whispered. But the device pulsed with a warning rhythm. Something was off. In the next intervention, they attempted to locate Helena, Tobias's missing sister. A slight temporal adjustment, a redirection of a single bureaucratic file, but instead of finding her, they discovered three different versions of Helena. One a researcher, one a resistance fighter, one seemingly erased from existence. Which one is real? Tobias demanded. Evelyn's response was clinical. In a multiverse scenario, all of them are. The clock towers of New Chronos began to react. Gears shifted in impossible patterns. Steam vents released pressure at irregular intervals. The very architecture of the city seemed to be breathing, responding to their temporal manipulations. Their third intervention targeted the root of Project Concordance, the initial research that had set everything in motion. But temporal mechanics proved maddeningly complex. Each adjustment created unexpected ripples. A government minister who had been a ruthless bureaucrat now appeared as a passionate education reformer. A military research facility transformed into a technical university. The changes were profound, yet so subtle that only those watching closely would notice. "We're walking a razor's edge," Garrick said, his voice tight with controlled tension. The temporal device hummed, warned, pulsed with an intelligence that seemed almost alive. Evelyn understood now what her multiple timeline selves had known. Time wasn't a linear path. It was a living, breathing system, and they were performing delicate surgery on its very essence. "One more adjustment," she said, her voice steady. "Just one more might set everything right." But in New Chronos, nothing was ever that simple. The Resistance headquarters had become a war room of temporal possibilities. Holographic projections flickered with intricate timelines, each thread representing a potential future, each potential future a delicate mathematical nightmare. Tobias found her. Helena wasn't dead, wasn't missing. She was something else entirely. "She's a living temporal anchor," Arya explained, her gearwork tattoos now moving with a life of their own, reflecting the complex temporal energies surrounding them. "Your sister isn't just a researcher, she's become part of the research." The holographic projection revealed Helena, older than Tobias remembered, her eyes holding a knowledge that seemed to transcend linear time. She existed simultaneously in multiple research facilities, multiple moments, multiple potential realities. Evelyn's temporal device pulsed with increasing urgency. The clock towers of New Chronos were no longer just keeping time, they were tracking something more fundamental, the very rhythm of possibility. "We have one chance," Inspector Garrick announced, his typically rigid demeanor replaced by a sense of desperate calculation. "One intervention that can stabilize the temporal cascade." The device showed multiple potential outcomes. In some, New Chronos burned. In others, it evolved into something unrecognizable. In a rare few, balance emerged. Helena's holographic image looked directly at Tobias. "Some choices," she said, her voice echoing across multiple timelines, "are bigger than the person making them." Evelyn understood now what her invention truly represented. It wasn't just a machine. It was a conversation between different versions of reality, a way to understand that time wasn't a straight line, but a complex web of interconnected possibilities. "We're not just saving a city," she said, her voice steady. "We're preserving the potential of human innovation." The final calculation approached. One moment, one choice, infinite consequences. Outside, the mechanical clouds of New Chronos began to gather. The clock towers leaned slightly, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting. Time is not a river, it's an ocean. Evelyn understood this now, her fingers hovering over the temporal resonance device, no longer just an invention, but a living bridge between possibilities. The device pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to breathe, to think, to calculate millions of potential futures in the space between heartbeats. Inspector Garrick stood beside her. The rigidity of his government training dissolved into something more human, something more understanding. "We get one moment," he said, "not a question, a statement of fundamental truth." Tobias watched, his young face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Helena's holographic presence flickered at the edges of perception, not quite here, not quite gone. The clock towers of New Chronos began to align, not just their physical gears, but something deeper, the fundamental rhythm of possibility. Evelyn made her calculation, not a destruction, not a complete reset, but a redirection. The temporal device sang, a note that wasn't heard but felt, a frequency that existed between sound and thought. In that moment, New Chronos shifted. A government research facility became a public innovation center. Unethical experiments transformed into open-source scientific collaborations. The mechanisms of control dissolved, replaced by mechanisms of potential. Helena materialized, fully present, fully herself. Not as a prisoner of research, but as a researcher of human potential. Some inventions, she said, echoing a version of Evelyn from another timeline, choose their inventor. Tobias found his sister, not through violence, not through desperation, but through understanding. Inspector Garrick watched the city recalibrate. The rigid systems he'd once protected now became something more fluid, more alive. And Evelyn? She understood now that her invention was never just about controlling time. It was about understanding it, respecting it, seeing it not as a linear path, but as a complex, breathing system of infinite potential. Outside, the mechanical clouds of New Chronos drifted. The clock towers chimed, not in perfect unison, but in a harmony that suggested something more important than precision: possibility.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this sci-fi story. Please like or subscribe to help this channel grow.